So thanks for giving me some time to talk about this. The data are evolving, I'll just say that. So what we're going to be getting today is kind of the first organized storytelling in a public way about the comprehensive survey. So all of this stuff is still under construction. The pandemic put something of a big cramp in the timeline for this particular research project because people were really hard to get in touch with. They weren't responding to emails, and of course nobody was in the office to answer a phone. So anyways, but here we are, and I'm going to share what we've got today. Because we're such a small group and it's super hard for me to pay attention to the chat while I'm also kind of going through slides and talking about stuff, I'll ask Stephen if you can give me a heads up, just interrupt me if you see something in the chat that we need to pay attention to.
I always got to watch out when you ask me to interrupt you, Helen. That's dangerous. Yeah,
this is one of the reasons why we've kept you on for so long, Stephen, because no good judgment and whatnot. So just please interrupt and say, hey, Helen, I've got a question. And if I don't have the answer, I'll tell you. If there's some data I've got, I'm happy to share stuff with you. So the origins of this survey go back to July, August 2019, when Sarah and Israel and I, with a colleague from Samford University, got together and we started talking about just lifelong learning in general and how we felt like Alam as an organization was trying to figure out how it best needed to resource this kind of poorly defined and disparate group of people doing work that we intuited kind of shared the same mission, but how do we talk about it and so on. And this is a far cry from the Alam, which was called SOCM back, let's say in the 70s, when in the heyday, Auburn Theological Seminary hosted a summer boot camp for new directors of continuing ed lifelong learning programs. And they actually had enough people sign up for this boot camp to be able to do it every year for a number of years. So it used to be that lifelong learning was a fairly clearly defined and homogeneous kind of activity. And these days, that clarity of definition had kind of dissipated for a number of reasons, including theological schools shifting and changing a lot, judicatories becoming increasingly stressed and dropping, in many cases, a lot of the responsibility they had held for doing this kind of education with lay and ordained leaders. Retreat and conference centers, of course, changing up their mission a bit. So there's a lot of change going on. So we decided that we wanted to figure out how we could better position Alam to serve its intended constituents well. And that meant going a step further back, which is to define who the constituents were and then hear from them so that we could see what was going on in the industry, so to speak, and where the pain points and the strengths happen to be. I also had this sort of evil mission to try to put some good data together so that we could get attention from big money, for example, the Lilly Endowment, and get some support for advocating for and promoting lifelong learning in the same way that Lilly has done such a lucrative and marvelous job promoting various aspects of theological PhD programs, teaching and learning in seminaries themselves, and clergy renewal. So anyway, so the people we have represented in this survey, I had a research assistant help me go through all 273 Association of Theological School member schools at the time, went through the websites, and we found that 84 of the schools in mid-2020 reported on their website having something like a lifelong learning program. So we looked at lifelong learning programs, we looked at continuing education. There's lots of different language, so that's another area of lack of clarity. We looked for certificate programs, stuff that intended to reach an audience outside of the immediate student body, and stuff that did not have credit-bearing programs associated with it. So we did not include, for example, Doctor of Ministry programs. The original landscaping of continuing education, lifelong learning that happened about 50 years ago did include Doctor of Ministry programs because they are de facto a way that many clergy seek lifelong learning, continuing education. But the motivation to enroll in them, according to research that's been done, tends to tack more towards the I want a cohort, I want to learn some more, I want to feel connected to a community like this, rather than just exclusively I want to get the credential that allows me to put new letters after my name and new letters before my name. So anyways, so we're not including Doctor of Ministry programs. We had 51 respondents from the ATS member schools. We have 67 responses to the survey overall. The 16 that are not included are either ATS member schools that did not identify themselves at the end of the survey as we requested, because we did allow people to remain anonymous in the survey, or continuing education lifelong learning programs that are housed elsewhere than a theological school in North America. So this could be a judicatory program like Stephen's program in United Church of Canada. It could be a retreat center. There were 2 churches, I believe, that have very robust lifelong learning programs. They responded and so on. So we're trying to figure out where continuing education is happening as part of this lifelong learning landscape. We collected information on programs, on directors, who they are, how they feel, what are their backgrounds, how did they learn to do what they're doing, and their perception of institutional support. So this comes through both financial support, material support, organizational support, inclusion, and important conversations. The felt sense of the director regarding whether or not they think that the institution buys into the importance of lifelong learning and so on. We conducted the survey. Most of the responses came in the 4-month period between the end of November of 2020 and March of 2021. So we were right in the middle of the pandemic. And because of that, we added a few COVID-specific questions. And as I said, what we're trying to do is map the landscape of lifelong learning. So with the way of organizing my little report is I could go through and show you this is what this answer data was. This is what this data showed. This is what the responses to this question were. But instead, this picture of who's directing continuing education, what their programs are like these days, started to emerge. And I used to be a fan of David Letterman's top 10 reasons for X, Y, and Z. And I think sort of organizing things with a discrete number of insights is kind of a helpful way to frame a first conversation about this stuff. So what I'm going to be talking about is 5 things that seem to be true about continuing education and its directors as regards the survey, that I think are important for both we who do this work to understand, as well as our administrators who are responsible for overseeing, supervising, and adequately supporting our work. So, first thing, we are really smart and resourceful. One might call us the MacGyvers of theological education and church. I mean, seriously, we are a lot more smart and resourceful than some of the other colleagues we might have in our institution. 36 of us who responded to this hold a doctorate. 30 hold PhDs, 6 hold Doctor of Ministry degrees. So more than half of us who responded to this survey could hold our own credibly on a theological school faculty. And I think that's really important. It's going to be increasingly important as we get towards the end. So I'm starting off really positive, and it's going to get a little bleaker as time goes on. So if you want to check out, I would say about 10 minutes from now is probably a good time. Secondly, we're scholar practitioners and we are adaptive learners. One of the questions we asked is, how did you learn how to do this work? And everybody gave a version of the School of Hard Knocks. Many people have come into this work within scholarly institutions, particularly from places like the pastorate or administrating other kinds of programs or field education direction or other kinds of jobs that tend to be intersectional jobs where you have to have a toolbox and you're constantly having to pull out the tools from your toolbox, know how to use them, and employ them for the sake of an emergent situation. We do a lot of evaluation. When I asked about evaluating programs, only 3 people said, no, we don't evaluate our programs at all. So what we see here is a very adaptive, nimbly learning kind of population. In fact, one might say a population that mirrors what we are trying to create with our, or encourage the development of, I should say, with our participants. And that's going to become important in just a moment. 60 of 67 of our respondents design more than 75% of their programs in-house. So adding to this, these smarts, adding to these adaptive, practical, pragmatic learners who create a good feedback loop of critical reflection on their work. We also have a massive metric ton of pedagogical expertise amassed in our area of work. And we're lifelong learners. We asked folks, what do you do for professional development? And they named, everybody named multiple things. Professional guilds, AAR, RAA, ALUM, ACFE, APSI, SBL. Some people had divergent interests in other fields like neurological science or other kinds of things. Most people go to conferences. Most people do a lot of reading and more. A lot of folks said that they sought out conversations with peers who would help them out. So we are doing the very thing that our job is intending to create an appetite for and serve the appetite of in other people. Number 2, we are really good at spinning gold from straw. One of the key pictures that emerged from this, not where little ugly people who steal, the firstborns of princesses, a la Rumpelstiltskin, but we are very good at doing incredibly valuable creative work with resources that could only be charitably called as minimal. There is no fat to trim in any of these programs, on any of these staffs, or in any of these budgets. And yet the volume of production that happens and the usefulness of that work is really kind of extraordinary. I would challenge people to put the return of investment on a continuing education program up against a Master's of Divinity program in a theological school any day of the week and see what the ROI is like. In terms of staffing, you can see there's kind of a nice reverse bell curve here. Reverse bell? No, this is bell curve. So most of our schools have 1 to 2 full-time staff equivalent, including themselves. A couple of lucky programs, Columbia, I'm looking at you, have more than 5. Yet more than a quarter of the programs that responded have only 1 part-time person on staff, which is kind of extraordinary. The annual budget, the most common response was less than $25,000 to do all of this work. Once again, I challenge you to put these staffing and budget numbers against any degree program. And then if you were add into, we didn't ask this in the survey, probably should have, is estimated number of constituents served over the course of the year. If you take a look at the number of students in an MDiv program versus the number of people served by continuing education program, it's no comparison. Just here at my shop, I'm a staff of 2. We run 50 programs a year and welcome about 2,000 people through the programs. It's, yeah. In the middle of that, we've also got a significant number of people who, in addition to doing all of this work, they're expected to cover their salaries and benefits with the income they generate from their programs. This is a very short-sighted requirement to place on continuing education lifelong learning offices, which we'll discuss as time goes on. The number of programs annually conducted by these very streamlined offices and budgets. You can see this is a scattergram. The numbers across the bottom represent the number of respondents total. This is the number of programs here on the y-axis. One of our programs, they said they do 100 or more per year. Another said 80 or more per year. A lot of schools do between the sort of 10 and 40. That's the majority of our numbers. And then there's a big spike from 50 up to other numbers. So these are high volume offices in general, especially when you compare that to the number of staff they host. And remember too that 75% of these offices create their own programs in-house. This represents a lot of creativity. And then when you factor in the fact that more than a third of them are expected to generate their own income and their salaries and benefits, excuse me, that's a huge weight that's being placed on them in addition to all of this creative energy. In terms of delivering format, we have hugely varied programs that are being offered. Many programs, as we'll see in a moment, went almost completely, if not completely, online with the pandemic. Many of these programs also said that they had been offering some online stuff before they went all online to the pandemic. They'll probably go back to something that's kind of hybrid or face-to-face along with online afterwards. And they've got lots of different formats, lectures, multi-day seminars, etc. This is a massive amount of creativity in a very tiny office. Number 3, this horrible pandemic that has killed 750,000 people and caused massive global disruption in every area of life was actually kind of a boon for people in continuing education. We asked them, what did the pandemic do to your staffing and budget, and what did it do to your programming? And folks said, in terms of programming, we've expanded around the world. It's supercharged it, accelerated it. We welcomed our first international students. Online. We went online. We're reaching all of these people. We have increased responsiveness to current events through our programming. This is a level of nimbleness that the theological school or the judicatory or other entity hosting the program would do well to listen to. Schools as a species, judicatories as a species are not nimble. G.K. Chesterton once described the church trying to change course as similar to an elephant trying to change direction in a swift moving river. So you can imagine how slow and methodical that would be. This tends to be the way our larger institutions operate. One might suggest that because of the small size of these offices and the lean staffs, there's a nimbleness that's permitted that the rest of the institution cannot participate in to the same degree, but I would argue should be learning from. The fourth thing that is part of this story and is that this idea that it's the future of theological education. And as we'll see, maybe it always has been. In doing this work, I've had the privilege to have a couple of really important conversations with key players. You'll notice that a lot of this is coming out of a theological school mold. I apologize if that makes those of you who are not in theological schools feel excluded, but I think that the observations they make are relevant in all of these areas of work because, particularly if you're in church work, you are in an industry that is being supported by this educational program that provides you with your clergy and your professionals. Dan Elshire, in a recent article in Interest magazine, says the times, however, are changing in the professional model of theological education. This idea that it's a professional training program, like training to be an accountant or a nurse or a doctor or a therapist. It's not going to be as good for the next century as it was in the last one. Theological education, if it is to be as good for the future as past versions, must change. And I followed up with a conversation with him. I spent like 3 hours talking with him about this stuff. And the conversation began with, Dan, if I read between the lines in this little article that you wrote, it looks like the future is really in non-credit bearing lifelong learning, continuing education stuff that is just-in-time education for people to respond to things that they are needing to deal with. And he unambiguously said, yes. He said that the role of theological education has been you give people 3 years of training and that prepares them adequately to a job that's got a fair amount of predictability. All of that has been dismantled. The understanding of what church is expanding. The understanding of theological educational preparation for that is expanding. The definition of ministry is expanding. And there are a lot of folks, in fact, 75% of our graduates from theological schools do not intend to lead traditional congregations. That is what the MDiv was designed for. So what does this mean? A couple of things. Number one, it's going to mean, as we'll see, that people are getting a whole lot of education that doesn't have immediate transferability to the work that they're doing. And number two, who's going to be there to pick up the pieces? One of the entities that is best positioned to do that is programs of lifelong learning, continuing education. We are nimble. We can provide just-in-time education. We can be low to the ground and in touch with what people need and respond to that with the programs that we develop. Last year, last year, I had a conversation with Frank Yamada, who succeeded Dan at ATS as the executive director, about the implications for the new standards of accreditation in theological schools, which went from about 200 pages down to 19, as these sort of thematic things were named. And the onus is now on the schools, instead of completing a checklist that has a massive amount of detail attached to it. Accreditation depends on the school doing a deep dive in their understanding of their mission and arguing for why they are effective in doing what they say they want to be doing. Great for the accreditors, a lot of work for the schools. For the first time, the work that we do is actually honored with a specific mention in standards. Standard 3.5 says that the school is going to be required to demonstrate an understanding of learning and formation as lifetime pursuits by helping students develop motivations, skills, and practices for lifelong learning. Well, if schools are going to help develop that appetite in their graduates, who's going to feed it? That's us. But this standard does is guarantee the need for the work that we do among theological school graduates. So a couple months ago, September, I had a conversation through one of these webinars with Debbie Jin, who does research at ATS. She talked about the mapping the workforce study that they conducted in 2017. They're rebooting it in 2022. They want to do it every 5 years. And they asked 940 graduates from theological schools. Excuse me, this is the one on the left is from the graduate student questionnaire. The one on the right is, no, excuse me, they're both from the Mapping the Workforce survey. My bad, I took out the slide that had the GSQ in it. These are the top 20 competencies graduates of theological schools say that they use at work. So you can see that there are a lot of topics here that are addressed by curricula in theological schools. You can see that there are some that are not. Excuse me, when they were asked to name what they wish they had learned more of in theological schools, these were the top answers. They wished they had learned more about administration, about leadership, about finance. These are all practical skills. One might ask, okay, well, one would, of course, acknowledge the importance of all of these skills here. But one might ask if a 3-year academic program is the best place to learn this stuff. Many of these things are arts that you learn as you're doing them. But it would be awfully good if you're going to be learning something from the School of Hard Knocks that you have a place where you can kind of reflect on things and talk about your growing sense of vocation and skill set as a leader and so on. This should be what's writing our curriculum in theological education. But what is? This is one of the places where I think we could do some good work as leaders in lifelong learning and ask some questions about whether or not these are the right content areas. When I asked folks to check all that apply, talk about what content areas they're offering through their programs, number one was leadership development. And that's a pretty broad topic, but it has to do with things like, Israel's programs at Columbia around clergy and the issues that happen with clergy. We do a transitional ministry program. A lot of other places do kind of vocational discernment kinds of things. But number 2, 3, 4, 5 basically mirror the traditional theological school curriculum, don't they? To go back to the other screen, we're not doing a whole lot of this social justice, conflict resolution, interpersonal competency, pastoral care and counseling stuff in terms of practical skills, finances, etc. So this is an area that we should probably be thinking hard about. Like, is the stuff that we're offering really the stuff people need? When I asked about special topics, what folks actually offered mostly in that area, because they could fill in the blank and in other, was stuff that was kind of a more granular version of some of the things up here. The only additions worth noting are Christian Ed and church history, a couple of programs offering that. But anyway, so this is what we're doing with our programs. So this is a trip in the Wayback Machine. This is a chart, a pair of charts I love to show. Almost every slideshow I do, I find a way to get the Brown-May study in here because I think it's kind of hysterical and ironic. So these charts come from the Brown-May study conducted in the early 1930s. It was the first comprehensive study on the effectiveness of preparation for ministry that had ever been conducted. And in many ways, it gave the current Association of Theological Schools its mandate to do accreditation with training programs for ministry. It was a study that was done with exclusively white male clergy in 3 states. Ohio, New York were 2 of them. So they had both professionally trained and untrained clergy in Methodist churches, asking them questions about how effective was the training you got and how important is this work in the ministry that you're engaged in. So the chart on the left, figure 36 over here, this ID measure over here, this thick black line is how important and difficult are these activities in your work. So for example, the pastoral care skills, the ministry leadership skills, the homiletical skills, the administrative skills, the educational skills. So people said that the pastoral skill was the most important and difficult thing that they did. The hash mark line below it is how helpful was your training, meaning your theological education, to prepare you for it. What you want to look for is a big difference between the black line and the hash mark line, because that tells you where the education didn't meet the actual need on the ground. So for example, over here, the ministry one, it's important and difficult, 86% say so. Helpful, 90, it was given a score of 90. So, that's pretty good. But for pastoral skills, all of these interpersonal things that we do with people, it's the most important thing they do, and it got a solid D rating. Okay. Administrative skills, important, but boy, the training didn't stack up, did it? Christian Ed, back in the day when churches actually did Bible studies, it's pretty well matched here. And civic duties, not real important and difficult. Yeah, I guess, the education didn't really address it. But what this says is all of the sort of practices-based skills that end up being the place in ministry, in nonprofit work and so on, where the rubber hits the road, where we're integrating all of this stuff in a way that impacts people's lives. That stuff that has never been taught well in theological schools. Never, 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 never. This is 100 years ago. It's still true, as we can see from the ATS data. This gives a perfect place for continuing education, lifelong learning programs to kind of lean in and provide spaces where people can either learn new skill sets or reflect on where the growing edges and rough spots are in their current practice. I won't bother with figure 34. I think that 36 is the most important. So I began to ask folks in the survey, hey, what are your program's growing edges? And I asked them to fill in the blank. And then I grabbed all of these sentences and threw them through a Wordle program. And this is what came up. So randomly, I'd love you guys to unmute and tell me, what are the big things that are jumping out at you right now in this world? The size of the word represents how many times it was articulated by a respondent. What's jumping out at you here?
Online.
Online? Mm-hmm. What else?
Engaging.
Engaging. Mm-hmm.
Assessment.
Assessment.
Audience.
What's tiny on here? Look at that.
Church.
Mhm.
Learning.
Mhm.
Courses.
But formation is big. Look at
That's an
that.
interesting observation, the size of the word learning versus formation and development.
Yep.
Thanks, Jessica.
Israel will speak at length on why we should not call the participants in our programs students. It does not reflect a good adult learning model.
Right.
These are people who are already doing stuff. They've already got wisdom. Our job is to create spaces where that wisdom can be reflected on and reappropriated as it's put in conversation with other resources that might be helpful. And what you see here is kind of the growing edge, really, of where theological education should be going to, less from a sort of scholarly based seminary traditional program. Remember what Dan Elshar was talking about in terms of the traditional professional training program that may have served the past well, it does not serve well now, but more development, formation, engaging. Online, I think, is more than just a modality. I think it has to do with recognizing that there are ways we need to reach people that affirm where they already are. That's one of the lovely things about online education. You don't have to remove people from their contexts in order to have them engage in reflection on those contexts. And particularly for people who are in remote areas with no access to theological schools or face-to-face programs, this is enormously important. I have found that we have in my PTS program here, we've had a cluster of Mormons from Idaho who have found some of our pastoral care and counseling programming to be very useful. We have pastors in rural Wyoming, in Montana. In fact, we've had the Wyoming people before. This particular year, in 2020 to 2021, we had participants from 49 states and 4 continents in our program. We had Africa, Asia, Europe, and North America. So this idea that there's this kind of affirmation of where people are and what's happening in their lives as part of the text and subtext of continuing education is, I think, a conversation that could easily be justified by this. And Growing Edges, we who direct continuing ed programs are on the front lines knowing what people out there want and need. The question I have is whether or not the host institution of that program has a robust feedback loop that allows the program to speak back into the mission, decision, allocation of resources, and practices of that institution. When I ask people what their program would be like in 5 years, what are some words that jump out here?
Collaborations.
Collaborations, I love that one. Yeah, and look how big it is. That means a lot of people are talking about that. And remembering what the list looked like from the Excel spreadsheet, they're talking about collaborations with churches, with organizations, with other offices within their institutions, everywhere. Collaborations everywhere.
Unpredictable.
Yep. But we've already seen that we're a bunch of MacGyvers with duct tape and Swiss Army knives, which is about the limit of the resources many of us get from our institutions to do this work. And we have a demonstrated capacity to be nimble and responsive that makes this not necessarily a scary thing, but a, I wonder what it's going to be like sort of thing.
Increase is pretty big, which, you know, that could be a good thing.
Oh, it is a good thing. And you'll see
depending on what's increasing. Yeah.
Yeah, actually, one of the things I didn't talk about with the COVID response, there are all these changes that happened as a result of COVID. The numbers of, so I asked, have things increased, decreased, stayed the same over 5 years, and then what was the impact of COVID? For COVID, a lot of schools said that there was a reduction in budget or staffing related to the pandemic, but an overwhelming number of schools said that their programming increased. One person said that their registrations increased 60%, 60%. Everybody seemed to talk about a growth trajectory coming down the pike, if not already manifested in their programs. Very few programs talked about a decrease or a shrinking or nobody wants this anymore. Everybody was talking about growing edge. It's going someplace, you know, there's new stuff happening. But Josh, for your best hope for continuing education to actually be manifested, it requires better integration. And what do I mean by integration? I'm talking about integration into the host institution, better integration into what we understand it to mean to do education with people who are interested in the work of ministry, whether it's lay or ordained. Better integration into the mission of the host institution and so on, better integration into the lives of the people we intend to serve, but mostly better institutional integration. So when I was asking folks, so what do you need in order to thrive? And then ask them to rate on a 1 to 5 Likert scales, I'll show you how they feel about the future of their program within the institution. Some really clear concerns come up. So what do they need in order to thrive? Let me hear an amen if you can relate to some of these words here. We need more support. We need more funding. We need more administrative, not oversight, but affirmation of the work that we're doing. We need time. Some people said we need more skills to do the work, but then we are also a bunch of people who didn't get professional training to do that work. We need more commitment from our institutions. There's a difference between where the directors see their programming within these institutions as relating to the constituencies that need this program and the perception of the institutions themselves about the centrality of these programs. When I asked people to tell us how we are supported professionally, this is also really interesting. 3/4 of us have additional institutional responsibilities besides leading continuing education. Jessica, I'm looking at you with your hyphenated job description. 9 out of 10 of us have access to professional development funds, like we'll be reimbursed to go to a conference or something. But a lot of folks said, I'd like to, but I don't have time to do it. Yeah, because if 3/4 of them have other responsibilities, where is there flex in the system? And you can guarantee that there's no cross training in those institutions either, where somebody else can take the helm while the person goes and does something to refresh themselves intellectually and professionally. 2/3 of us are not permitted to do sabbatical. And yet, more than half of us have qualifications that would be able to count us among the faculty. I think that's incredibly short-sighted because one could easily argue from the earlier slides that the work we do is incredibly energy intensive. All of that creativity, all of that high volume programming, all of that interfacing with outside constituents, that can deplete people. And without the opportunity to renew those creative well springs from which all this incredible work comes, we didn't ask questions about burnout. I was actually quite pleased to see how long many people have been in their roles. It's basically split half. The halfway point is about 8 years. So half on one side of 8 years, half on the other side of 8 years. When I asked if they had additional support professionally, they gave lots of vague, fluffy terms like, yeah, I've got space and permission, I've got encouragement. Lifelong learning is valued. But one person said, I think they would allow me to take time off for professional renewal if I asked. I think they would give me professional support if I asked, but it's not in a standard quantifiable way. So it's kind of like telling somebody who's hungry and panhandling on the street to, God bless you, stay warm and well fed. You know, well wishes, thoughts and prayers. The intention is good, but the responsibilities and time constraints limit my ability to use that benefit. These are direct quotes from the survey data. So what I see in this is that there are good intentions and kind of a generalized recognition that this stuff's important, but there aren't concrete institutional structures that can support and protect one of our professionals as they try to do the work that they need to do to be lifelong learners themselves, constantly being renewed and refreshed. So we're not really given formal permission and support to do the very thing that we're providing other people with the opportunity to do. When I asked folks, what else would you like to say? You know, I got the typical, oh, no, nothing. A couple of folks said there was a typo in question 21. I'm like, roll my eyes. Other people thanked us for asking these questions. But these were some pretty hard things I saw people write. The institution does not see lifelong learning as essential to the mission. Is there a pill that opens the eyes of administrators to the critical importance of lifelong learning? There isn't, but perhaps if we find a way to leverage these data in our institutions, we can make the case for why it's important. Lifelong learning was shut down at my institution 5 years ago. A new program was begun and expected to be self-sustaining in 3 years. 1.5 of those years were a pandemic. That's unrealistic. Would they do this with a degree program? So it's clear that a lot of administrators in our institutions are not perceived as grokking the importance of our work. One person, and only one person, had a positive thing to say in this add-on question. We are considered the growing edge rather than the fringe program at our institution. I asked people to talk about, the degree to which they see institutional and personal support for their work. I asked them to rate these on a 1 to 5 Likert scale, asking them, do you agree with this statement? I'm included in decisions regarding my area of work. When a number is over 4, it's pretty good. given the fact that people often inflate their responses to these questions, you really want to see something around a 4.5. Organizational leadership affirms the importance of the work. Oops, it's only in the 3 range. It's from strongly disagree to strongly agree. And this is kind of meh, in the middle. It's integral to the mission of the organization, a little bit lower. It's reflected in key organizational documents, strategic plans, constitution, etc. But personally, people's sense of attachment to their work is quite high. And they do feel, or they're reporting that they feel a great sense of satisfaction, interpersonal support. They believe that it's the future of theological and religious education. They have access to some of the resources they need. That one's a little bit lower. And do they have concerns? I kind of disagree with that, but they're also used to things kind of maintaining a status quo. So my question for y'all is, and this is our last slide, I'm going to stop sharing here. What do administrators need to know from these results so far? These aren't all the data, of course, because I didn't want to bore you any more than you are already tired at this time of day. But what seems to be important for administrators to know? And in your reflection on this, what should Alam be doing with these data that would help you advocate for the importance of your work at your institution and help the organization as a whole advocate for the importance of lifelong learning, continuing education? Go ahead and unmute. In fact, I'm going to mute.
Well, Helen, whoops. Helen, first of all, I want to thank you for this presentation. It wasn't boring to me at all. And, you know, I've spent years in this field, and I think the results are very telling. They're also, I think, important and helpful for us to get our heads around. And if somehow, as you kind of begin to wrap up the survey itself, if there's a way to share some of these results with members of Alam for us to share with our institutions, I think that would be really helpful.
One of the things I'm hoping to do as a follow-up to this is to collect information from judicatories. I've got a list of all of the judicatories and numbers to call, of course, and some email addresses to use, but there's been great turnover in judicatory offices. And a lot of people haven't been answering their work phones. So once people start to really solidify their presence back in the office, I want to add to this information from church leadership, like, where are you going, or where do you expect your people to go for continuing education? Are you providing any of it, etc.? So there's that piece. In terms of providing information, Tay has volunteered to create some infographics. It's in the chat, and this is being recorded, Tay, don't forget. But I think providing you guys with easy access to some of this information, as well as the story that seems to be coming out of it, is going to be important. One of the things that I want to do once I finish collecting data, I've got 4 more people who've said they want to fill out the survey, so I'll update the data at that point, is to start doing some cross-tabbing of the data. Like for the people who say, I don't get much institutional support, how does that compare with their budgets? How does that compare with their staffing, et cetera? So see where there might be some meaningful data points in all of this. Although just as it is, the data seem to be telling a pretty uniform story about the importance and lack of recognition of the work that we do.
Yeah, I think having tools like the infographics will be really helpful. I'm also wondering if offering to make some version of this presentation, even live, available to subgroups of the REA, like an executive committee, or some of the other guilds, like Kathy had mentioned ADME, which is the contextual ed, or the DMin, doctor of ministry people, that we could target sharing this with some specific conversation partners that might find it illuminating as well.
I think two groups would be ADME, the Doctor of Ministry Educational Programs, and ATFE, the Theological Field Educators Program. Actually, the current chair of ATFE is 5 doors down the hall from me, that way, Barbara Blodgett. So because of 2 reasons. Number one, the primary reason why people go into Doctor of Ministry programs is to do lifelong learning. Number 2, field education often becomes the place where a lot of connective tissue is developed for students as they figure out where those intersections are between their scholarly work and their practice and so on. So I think those would be 2 things. The other thing, I don't think I mentioned this at the beginning, this little slideshow is a test drive for an article that I've been asked to write for Intrust magazine. Intrust is read by theological school administrators and boards. So I want to be super clear on what boards and presidents and deans are hearing. So if y'all want to tell me what parts of this to highlight in order for them to kind of hear the gospel, I would be all ears. I mean, I've got my own ideas, but I want this to be a crowdsourced thing. What are your thoughts?
Well, Helen, I think that's an excellent idea. This is Daryl Stevens from Lancaster Theological Seminary. And I would encourage you to not only an article in Intrust, but this would be really valuable research to put in a peer-reviewed article. So I want to encourage you that direction as well and get it into the literature. I want to add my thanks for your presentation and also respond to your query, what do administrators need to hear? I think there's a lot of fear that degree programs are under pressure and hemorrhaging students. I think there's some fear that these non-degree programs are multiple pathways to ordination are gonna supplant the degree programs. So I think there's a little bit of competition there that I think we just need to address that, the more my administration supports the non-credit bearing courses, and I think there's a sense of a zero-sum game going on.
Which is too bad, because the purpose of the theological school is not to churn out a particular degree, it's to provide theological education. And there are lots of ways to provide theological education. As we are learning now, there are lots of ways to be church too. So that there will always be a market for the classic MDiv program. I think to hedge one's institutional future bets on the growth of that program is pretty short-sighted. I have a little analogy I like to draw. I don't know if you remember back in the day, Neutrogena shampoo had an ad campaign that said, yeah, keep on using your regular shampoo, and once a month or once every 3 weeks, we want you to use Neutrogena, because what Neutrogena will do is strip away all of the buildup on your hair that allows your shampoo to work more effectively. And I thought, that's freaking brilliant. They're not trying to replace, they're trying to say, hey, you need us too, because we're going to help the stuff that you're already attached to work even better. Well, Fuller had a genius ad campaign for their theological school that was similar. It was you can be a better lawyer, a better banker, a better professional out in the white collar world, whatever, with a theological degree. We can teach you about ethics, we can teach you about vocation, all of that stuff. Like we want to come alongside the other stuff that's happening and make it even better. And what Frank Yamada and the ATS Commission standards are talking about, and what Dan Aylshire is talking about, is how lifelong learning isn't a replacement for degree programs. It's a continuation of the covenant we make with students in theological schools to continue to support them in a journey that is lifelong, and because of the changing context that we're in, will constantly require pivoting. So we give them a good base. We understand a degree program to be a good base, but then we put equal support into walking alongside them in an ongoing way, supporting their professional practice and inviting other people into the educational fold, like curious laity, so that the communities themselves can be stronger and not just dependent on the leadership of a single person. We want to be Neutrogena. We want to help the theological schools do what they think of as their primary important thing more effectively. So coming up with ways to dismantle this fallacious zero-sum game argument, I think is crucial. That's crucial.
I mean, if you're talking about, highlighting things for the in-trust readers, especially presidents, the senior administrators, in that, as a VP for academic affairs, yeah, the one thing that we all talked about, the president of the board and the president of the school and myself, was how do we increase enrollment in these difficult times when the younger generation are not turning to the seminaries in big numbers? How do we find the money and support the stakeholders? Because if we don't support the stakeholders, they won't send us new students or money, right? That's the concern. How do we make our programs relevant and attractive to students? One, so that we fulfill our mission statement and our vision and our program outcomes, but more importantly, to keep students. So every MDiv student we graduate, for example, you want two things to happen down the road. They need to be happy about and proud of their education. So you want them, one, to come into the DMIM program down the road after they've done some field work, right? And you want them to refer people from their church. To me, it makes perfect sense that with a good, as you was talking about, a lifelong learning program that complements and supports the formal theological degree work, you have a winner in that. And a president of a school and a president of the board who are critical in that, getting that message out. If you win that heart, their attention on that level, then you've got a winner. And a fan, a supporter of lifelong learning. Unfortunately, the last three presidents we've had that I had to work under until they let me go, were not interested in lifelong learning. They were so academically focused. That's all that mattered to them, having a good quality product. Now, I was lucky that they let me play all I wanted down in Maryland, but they didn't care. So that was fine. But what the students came back as down in Maryland, whoa, this is wonderful. And I had a whole church in the degree program. The whole church, because the pastor was a proud alum and learned things, and he passed those things on as lifelong learning. Then we inherited all of them. So
this is an interesting point, because if many of these schools are reporting that their enrollment increased, and I think 5 programs, said that there's a decrease in their programming or some kind of negative impact due to COVID. Everybody else said that COVID has been incredible for their continuing ed program. All these new contacts that you're making are new friends of your institution. So the idea that we have to pay our own salaries and benefits on such a streamlined program, first of all, I'd like to make them think of the faculty in a similar way, especially the faculty who teach these tiny little classes in an esoteric subject and only have 5 students. It's a bankrupt model because we are part of the fulfillment of the educational mission of the institution. And for judicatories, the lifelong learning programs sponsored by church bodies are absolutely crucial in the ongoing effectiveness of their pastors, the vibrancy of their congregations, and avoiding things like burnout and feelings of isolation. So what can schools do with all of these new touch points? I brought in a spreadsheet with over 1,000 names on it, including addresses sorted by geographic location, walked into our admissions director's office and said, "You're welcome. these were all people who had been part of the continuing ed program in early 21. Said, take a look at these data. Are there geographic regions we haven't been paying attention to? Are there constituencies that we haven't thought about? Who are the folks who are attracted to our stuff? Can we do more intentional outreach there? Can we friend raise? My office is the only one in theological education that's in advancement and not academic affairs. And I think that's great. I'm having a lot of fun. But this idea that we are somehow on the edges of our institutions, whatever those institutions are, and are able to do this kind of bridge building is absolutely crucial. Erin, I love your observation over here about the added value of cross-institutional collaboration in light of financial concerns. Absolutely. I have done really hard work, for example, in my office, to build intentional relationships with the Lutheran bishop, the Methodist bishop, the Episcopal bishop, the EPs, and all the regional presbyteries, et cetera, because I know they need support for their folks and they can't afford to do so. So I meet with them and I say, okay, what do you want? I'm designing a program here. Let's see if we can join forces on this. I'm not necessarily working with judicatory leaders at this point who get the importance of actively supporting this. There's still this sort of volunteerism effort. Like if you just sort of dangle it out there, if you build it, they will come. And that's not true because people sometimes need to be given concrete permission or encouragement to participate in this stuff. So that's a reality. But I do think that this is the way forward because this is how our communities and the leaders in those communities who come to us for the programming will learn how to be vibrant and not avoid the John Wayne solo pastor thing or whatever that leads to burnout and ineffectiveness. So
I think there's another audience that needs to hear this stuff too. And it's not being named quite so clearly here today because you all work in schools. I work in adjudicatory. Mm-hmm. And the continuing education in the United Church of Canada, apart from the stuff I do, is all higgledy-piggledy. It's done by program staff who have all sorts of other things they do too. So our Office of Vocation staff who do oversight of ministry and discipline also teach the boundaries courses. And our intercultural ministries officer also teaches the racial justice training. And the stewardship staff teach courses in philanthropy and fundraising. And when I stop and look at the shop I work in, there are all sorts of different programs that are really educational. Educational for professional church workers and volunteer leadership. They're very much practically focused. But there's no sense or very little sense of coordination and sort of acknowledgement that all of these are educational enterprise. And so they hire me at halftime to run the webinar program, and they're astounded that what I do is put all of them onto my webinar platform. But most denominations aren't even doing that. And so the denominational programming is scattershot rather than organized.
Right. This chat is fabulous. Both those speaking up and those who are in the chat.
Yep.
So Stephen, to your point, is there usefulness then in us working together to construct a document that can be sent to judicatory leaders about what we're learning about lifelong learning programs and the perceived importance of these programs?
Absolutely.
Vibrancy, because this is also something that ATS data would contribute to well. In fact, I can see doing something like this after they get their 5-year workforce study data.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree. I've seen earlier in the chat, I was suggesting that actually maybe what we need is a package of materials that could go out and be used depending on the particular situation, kind of in a modular fashion. So having like a little 5-minute or 10-minute video, having some infographics that could be put alongside it in a report that someone's already generating for another purpose, having, an actual kind of white paper, this a more academic kind of juicy footnoted kind of document. I mean, all these things are useful in different contexts. So I think like a package would be nice. But yeah, there's a lot of conversations that are happening at kind of judicatory levels, but often they don't need to be convinced on the need for these kinds of resources.
No.
What they need to figure out is how to do them. Right?
And how to focus it, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Because
how to
they've
coordinate
got,
it. Yeah.
I mean, in our denomination, Tay's working in a different branch of the United Church too. We've got all kinds of educators. We've got educators in the regional council offices. We've got educators in the retreat centers. We've got you in the Toronto United Church Council, and Katya and Jill, and there's me in general council. I mean, there's all kinds of educators, but there's no sort of focus to it. So it's hard to know where to find stuff. It's hard to know where the holes are. Nobody's kind of got the big picture.
Well, and I think some of our tools could help some of our organizational thinkers think a little more broadly. And it sounds like that there's some energy to help produce and think about and distribute them. But I do think, judicatories, and as Lindsay also represents the, lots of participants in faith-based, are faith-based, but go to other places for their enrichment and skill set development. And the ATS standards reduced from however many pages to 18 or 19 to perhaps model some nimbleness, and institutions are slow to catch up because they still want to be so pedantic about what they need to do to justify whether a Con Ed course might fulfill a requirement. And I'm not necessarily being totally pejorative there, but that there need to be some ways that we can foster that collaboration.
Sarah, I think too, there's a way that I think that this amazing research could also benefit the independent Con Ed community, which I think Tay and I have been chatting about on the side a little bit, because we're not judicatories and we're not seminaries, and yet, not because we're saying seminarians come. 2/3 of our over 1,200 students now, or learners now, are completely faith-based, many of them ordained ministers, and they're coming to fill a void. And so that's the conversation I often have with deans, because we'll pick up the phone and call a dean to say, we've got one of your students that would like to take a course, and we'd like to have a conversation with you about how that student might gain credit for that course, so that their time is spent well, because your institution doesn't offer something in this category and they think they would enhance their learning with the direction that they feel called in. So we want to see ourselves as kind of filling a void rather than trying to replace someone. And I kind of mentioned in the side that 9 times out of 10, that conversation begins with a very miffed dean who's like, who are you and what are you doing in my space? And instead, at the end, it often turns into this beautiful conversation of, well, we would love to offer a course like that, but one, we maybe don't know somebody, or we're an institution, we can't turn the ship that quickly. But an extension of this research could be these independent platforms that are also offering and helping fill voids to say, look, we don't all have to do the same thing and try to do it all better than each other. What if this independent school did X and this independent school did this and this seminary did this and this judicatory did this, and then we start to enhance the platform. And the goal is not prop up institutions that are struggling financially or try to get more staff for LLLs, but the goal is to give these ministers what they need for the world to be relevant change makers. What if that were the goal? I think this research has the potential to help our conversation with these deans not always become miffed as well in the beginning. Yeah.
I've miffed a couple of seminary deans lately. And,
Yeah.
and one of the ways that I miff them is I'm crazy to insist that it should only take a month or 2 to develop a course. What nonsense. Everyone knows that a course takes 6 months or a year. Like what? It's interesting actually, talking to some schools, like I was talking to a major Ivy League school that's not here today. They're my alum, and their education is kind of their continuing education lifelong learning system is kind of a mess. They're kind of rebooting it this year. And I talked to the coordinator, and I looked at some of her content, and it wasn't awesome. Like the professor was awesome, and I had him when I was there, but nobody said to him, "Hey, get the camera out of your nose and put it at eye level." Nobody said to him, "Hey, maybe your PowerPoint should have some pictures and not just blocks of text that are unreadable." Why didn't they tell him that? Because he's tenured faculty, right? And nobody's going to tell him how to teach, right? And I said this to her, and she said, "Absolutely, you're right. It's just we're so swamped, we just take what we can get and put it online. Like we're not even like having conversations about pedagogy."
Yeah, and Tay, at our school, we require that everyone take a training course on how to teach online, and it's given to them to help them prepare. Like we would happily offer this to others.
Hey,
to
I might
try to
license
have,
that from you. I was in a conversation today with a learning designer about building such a course.
we
so,
built a
yeah.
whole course so that they can take off and use every aspect of the online technological world to enhance who they are. In every way, from lighting to less is more, to breaking down things, to sending out reminder emails that are integrated into the system to make sure that they pick up Monday's content. Like we can do this well. We can train each other to do this well. I believe we can, but we have to equip them.
Yes, that's something that Israel's helped equip us to do more effectively when he came to Columbia, and it has made a difference. And many of our leaders, then we're feeding the leader pipeline in enhancing their skills, which is that's part of pointing back to our contributions to Helen's research, being lifelong learners ourselves and finding ways to be equipped. Well,
Yet too many senior faculty look me in the face and say, after doing a program like that, "I'm not going to change. I'm too old to change." So hopefully younger faculty will change that for them.
Yeah, I mean, there are issues with faculty. If they suck, I don't invite them to be in my program again. But I'm not sure that that's where the resistance is. I think the conversation we were having earlier about fear, and when we were talking with Daryl about this misguided perception that it's a zero-sum game. First of all, it's a theologically bankrupt idea. Don't even get me going in the theology that's behind a sort of fear of scarcity that's going on. You take people back to a theology that says, hey, 100% of us are gifted to do this work of God in the world, and 100% of us are needed to do it. And God's already said that the way will be provided. So let's start improving our creativity and imagination when we're looking for the places and the ways that this can happen. So if we're operating out of a theology of abundance, there's plenty of abundance to talk about in the programs that we're running, all these new connections that we're making, all this freaking creativity, people. I mean, this is the story of COVID. We pivoted. We did awesome things. We did amazing stuff. We got new people into the fold. We used to be maybe mostly face-to-face. We're now online. We're learning how to do it well. We're developing just-in-time programs that address people's needs in these exigent times. And the most successful thing I did last year was a program for women who were just overly burdened by the caretaking and other responsibilities of the pandemic. I called it Wise Women. I had a bunch of awesome women present. I had over 1,002 women sign up for this thing, 17 guys, 1,002 women. And it was incredible. Like we know how to do this stuff. We can pivot. And if there's a way that our story and these data can help relieve the anxiety of administrators and say, no, we're not your cash cow. The response to the problems right now is not a lack of money that's causing them. It's a lack of imagination. And imagination abounds in many of these creative continuing ed programs. So, I mean, we can put the nasty ogres in our crosshairs, but I'd rather find a way to spin the story of our awesomeness in a way that reduces fear.
Well, this has been an exhilarating conversation for sure. I want to, on behalf of all, thank Helen for her continued fine work, and thank everyone here for your contributions today as we wrap up our 2021 year, and as the leader team prepares to hand off to Joshua in the coming year, there will be more webinars. There will be more things like this. We will follow up with some of you who have made great suggestions and offered to assist, because when Stephen and I came onto the board in 2012 or whenever it was with a hope that we could continue to have this organization be relevant and reinvigorate, or help it die a good death. And we felt equally convicted that both was possible at that time, and was theologically sound, if that be the case. We are also, those of us here, very convicted that lifelong learning is an essential part of ongoing formation for our faith-based leaders. And your support here, your comments here, are why we have 50% more members than a year ago, and participation at the webinars, and I'm sure that they will continue. So thank you to all. We are at that hour, and are there any other closing questions or comments in the chat before we invite Josh to close us in prayer?
If we could just take a moment to thank you, Sarah, and to thank Stephen, and basically the two of you and many others as well have been holding down the fort for Alum, especially over the last 10 years. Sarah, I know, and Stephen, I know most closely just by working with you all, but seeing how much you have put into this organization to keep it going, even during lean times, I know hasn't always been easy. I hope you feel like your efforts have been rewarded, that you feel satisfied with where things are, and also hopeful as we have these amazing conversations and continue to look towards the future and doing it together and continuing to learn from each other. But you've set the path, and you and Stephen have really done a lot. So we just want to thank you.
Well, thank you.
I think the future is bright for this organization, and I am so excited by today's conversation and by the energy in the room. It's just a privilege to be part of it. So thank you to each of you who are coming on to the leadership team, and looking forward to seeing what happens next.
Yes, thank you all. And Aaron, I'll send you a note, but Laura Heifetz and Amy Steele and those folks have they've done a webinar with us, and we're in conversation with them to do a follow-up. So thank you for connecting with them and with us too.
That's great.
So that's what, connection and collaboration.
That's it.
And being nimble, and that's what connection, conversation, critical conversations. Let's keep up the great work.
That's great.
Joshua? Thanks.
Sure. So will you join me in prayer, please? God that unites us all, Holy Spirit that moves in the world in ways mysterious as well as seen, that somehow connects a community through Zoom, that somehow creates bonds through this technology, that somehow stimulates and encourages and enlivens us through these bites and bits. We pray for everyone here, for their own ministries, for their own organizations, institutions, adjudicatories, systems in which they find themselves, and for the people which they serve. We pray for enriched hearts and minds and spirits. We pray for the work that they are doing, and that we see the fruits, we see glimpses of beloved community and learning community that keep us going. And as we come together, as we find opportunities to gather as a community here and elsewhere, we continue to help each other find bread for the journey. And be with us as we go from this place, and with our families, and with those who cannot be here, and those who are forgotten or feel forgotten and lost. May your Spirit truly work within and among and through us to bring hope and healing to the world and wherever we find ourselves. We ask this in the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen.